and hidden inside the Psalms are words that breathe strength into weary hearts and peace into restless minds. Every verse carries a reminder that God still sees, still listens, and still moves in the lives of those who trust him. When fear rises and hope feels distant, the Psalms become a shelter for the soul. They speak to pain, uncertainty, waiting, and victory with honesty and power. Today, these promises can become the anchor that carries you through every challenge standing before you. In life, when pressure surrounds you from every side and it feels like your heart can no longer carry the weight of what you are facing, the mind becomes restless, sleep disappears, and fear begins speaking louder than faith. In those moments, the Psalms remind you that God never expected you to survive by your own strength alone. He becomes a refuge for the weary, a shelter for the broken, and a hiding place for those who feel overwhelmed by life's storms. Psalm 46 declares that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. That promise was not written for perfect days. It was written for moments when the earth feels like it is shaking beneath your feet and everything around you seems uncertain. Sometimes the battle is invisible. People may see your smile while never realizing how much pain you are carrying inside. You may be fighting anxiety about your future, grief from your past, or exhaustion from constantly trying to hold everything together. Yet the Psalms speak directly into those hidden struggles. They remind you that God sees what nobody else sees. He hears the prayers you could not even put into words. He notices the tears that fell in silence during nights when you felt completely alone. When David wrote many of these psalms, he was not sitting in comfort. He wrote while being hunted, betrayed, rejected, and surrounded by danger. Still, in the middle of chaos, he kept returning to the same truth. God was his refuge. A refuge is more than a temporary escape. It is a place of safety when danger is near. It is where fear loses its power and peace begins to return. The Psalms reveal that God himself becomes that place for his people. When life overwhelms you, you do not have to pretend to be strong. You do not have to hide your struggles from God. The beauty of the Psalms is that they give permission to be honest. David cried out in fear, confusion, and in weakness, yet every cry eventually led him back to trust. He understood that God was closest during the moments when human strength failed. There are days when you may feel emotionally drained from carrying responsibilities, disappointments, and unanswered prayers. The enemy wants you to believe that because you feel weak, you are abandoned, but the Psalms teach the opposite. God moves near to those who are crushed in spirit. He stays close to hearts that are weary and burdened. Psalm 91 speaks about dwelling in the shelter of the Most High and resting in the shadow of the Almighty. That image is powerful because it reminds you that God does not simply watch from a distance. He covers, protects, and surrounds his people even while storms continue around them. The world often teaches people to rely only on themselves, but the Psalms teach dependence on God. They show that true strength is found in surrender. Sometimes God allows situations that are too heavy for human strength, so that you will discover the safety of his presence in a deeper way. When you finally stop trying to control everything and begin placing your trust fully in him, peace slowly starts replacing panic. And the storm may not disappear immediately, but your soul begins to stand on something stronger than fear. The Psalms also remind you that God remains faithful through every season. He was a refuge yesterday, he is a refuge today, and he will remain a refuge tomorrow. People may fail you. Circumstances may change without warning. Plans may collapse. But the promises hidden inside these sacred words continue standing firm through every generation. When you feel surrounded by uncertainty, the Psalms call you back to the unchanging character of God. They remind you that no battle is greater than his power, and no burden is heavier than his ability to sustain you. Even when your emotions tell you to give up, the Psalms teach your soul to keep trusting. They train your heart to look beyond temporary trouble and remember that God is still in control. Every verse becomes a quiet reminder that you are not fighting alone, not walking alone, and not carrying life's weight by yourself. In moments when everything feels unstable, his presence becomes the solid ground beneath your feet, beneath your feet. That is why the Psalms continue speaking hope into hearts across generations. They do not know and pain, but they reveal a God who brings peace in the middle of it. The world searches for peace in possessions, success, distractions, and temporary comforts, yet real peace cannot be found in anything that changes with time. The peace spoken about in the Psalms comes from the presence of God himself. It is deeper than emotions and stronger than circumstances. It remains steady even when life feels uncertain. There are seasons when the mind becomes filled with noise. Fear about tomorrow, regret from yesterday, and pressure from today all compete for attention at the same time. Many people smile outwardly while inwardly carrying anxiety that drains their strength every single day. The Psalms understand this struggle because they were written from places of real human emotion. David often poured out his fears honestly before God, but again and again peace entered his heart when he remembered who God was. Psalm 23 paints this beautiful picture of the Lord leading his people beside still waters and restoring their souls. That restoration is not only physical, it reaches deep into the heart and mind where worry tries to take control. God's peace does not always arrive by instantly and removing the storm. Sometimes he calms the soul before he calms the situation. That is one of the hidden promises inside the Psalms. Even while enemies surrounded David, he spoke about lying down and sleeping in peace because he trusted that God was watching over him. Imagine having a heart so anchored in God that fear no longer controls your thoughts. That is the kind of peace the Psalms invite you into. A peace that does not depend on perfect conditions, but on the certainty that God remains near. Many people are exhausted because they carry burdens they were never meant to carry alone. They replay problems repeatedly in their minds, searching for answers that only God can provide. The Psalms gently redirect that weight back to him. Psalm 55 says to cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. That promise reminds you that God never intended for your soul to collapse under the pressure of life. He invites you to release your fears into his hands because he is strong enough to hold what you cannot. There are moments when peace seems impossible because life feels too broken. You may have prayed for things that never happened, trusted people who disappointed you, or waited longer than expected for answers. In those moments, frustration can slowly replace faith, yet the Psalms continue calling your heart back to trust. They remind you that God is still working, even when you cannot immediately see it. Peace grows when you stop measuring God's faithfulness only by visible results and begin remembering his unchanging character. The Psalms also reveal that worship has power over a troubled mind. David often shifted from fear into praise while writing. At first he would cry out in distress, but by the end of the psalm he was declaring confidence in God again. Something changes when a heart focuses on God instead of fear. Praise interrupts panic. Gratitude weakens despair. Worship lifts your eyes beyond temporary struggles and reminds you that God's authority is greater than every situation trying to overwhelm you. Sometimes the greatest battle is happening within your own thoughts. Negative voices may tell you that nothing will improve, that you are forgotten, or that your future is hopeless. But the Psalms answer those lies with truth. They remind you that God is your shepherd, protector, deliverer, and source of hope. His peace becomes a guard over and your heart when uncertainty tries to steal your confidence. Even during waiting seasons, his presence gives strength to continue moving forward one day at a time. The peace of God is not weakness. It is spiritual confidence rooted in trust. It allows a person to stand firm while others fall apart because their heart is anchored in something eternal. The Psalms teach that peace is possible not because life becomes easy, but because God remains faithful through every difficulty. His promises become a quiet refuge for the troubled soul, bringing rest to hearts that have been carrying too much for too long. That is why the Psalms constantly point back to the strength of God instead of the strength of man. Human strength has limits. There comes a point where determination, effort, and endurance alone are no longer enough to carry you through what you are facing. The body grows tired, the emotions become heavy, and the heart begins to question whether it can keep going. Yet hidden inside the Psalms is the powerful reminder that God's strength appears most clearly in moments of weakness. Many people believe they must always appear strong in front of others. They hide their and our struggles, suppress their emotions, and convince themselves that needing help is failure. But the Psalms reveal something different. David was a warrior and a king, yet he openly admitted when he felt afraid, exhausted, or overwhelmed. He cried out to God from caves, battlefields, and lonely nights filled with uncertainty. Instead of pretending to have everything together, he brought his weakness honestly before God. That honesty became the doorway for God's strength to enter his life. Psalm 73 speaks about the flesh and heart failing, yet declares that God is the strength of the heart forever. That verse carries deep meaning because it acknowledges a reality many people try to deny. Sometimes your own strength will fail. There will be seasons where you cannot rely on confidence, energy, or emotional stability to survive. Life can bring burdens so heavy that they expose human weakness completely. But weakness is not the end of the story. The Psalms teach that when human ability reaches its limit, God's power begins to sustain what could not survive alone. There are moments when you may feel spiritually drained because you have fought too many battles for too long. You may feel and tired of waiting, tired of struggling, and tired of carrying responsibilities that never seem to end. During those moments, the enemy often whispers that your weakness means defeat. But throughout the Psalms, weakness becomes the very place where God proves his faithfulness. David repeatedly survived situations that should have destroyed him, not because he was naturally unstoppable, but because God strengthened him in ways human power never could. God's strength often works quietly before it works visibly. Sometimes he strengthens you by giving peace in chaos, endurance in hardship, or courage to face another day when you thought you had nothing left. The Psalms reveal that divine strength is not always dramatic on the outside. Often it appears as the quiet ability to continue trusting God when circumstances give you every reason to quit. It becomes the steady voice inside your soul saying, "Keep going, God is still with you." One of the greatest hidden promises in the Psalms is that weakness does not disqualify you from being used by God. In fact, God often chooses weak moments to reveal his glory more clearly. When people look at your life and realize you should have fallen and part but somehow kept standing, they begin to see evidence of a strength greater than your own. The Psalms constantly redirect attention away from self-reliance and back toward dependence on God. They remind you that victories are not won by human power alone, but by the sustaining hand of the Lord. Psalm 18 describes God as the one who equips his people with strength and makes their feet secure. That means strength is not something you must create alone. God provides what you need for each season you face. When fear tries to weaken you, he gives courage. When sorrow drains you emotionally, he gives comfort. When uncertainty shakes your confidence, he gives stability. His strength adapts to every battle because he understands every burden you carry. Sometimes people assume strength means never crying, never struggling, or never feeling tired. But the Psalms show that real spiritual strength is continuing to seek God even while carrying pain. David worshipped while wounded, prayed while afraid, and trusted while surrounded by trouble. That kind of faith is powerful because it refuses to let suffering separate the heart from God's presence. There are also moments when God allows us and acknowledge the humble the heart and draw it closer to him. When life feels easy, people often rely on themselves without realizing it. But difficult seasons reveal how deeply you truly need God. The Psalms teach that dependence on him is not weakness at all. It is wisdom. The person who trusts God gains access to strength that does not collapse under pressure. Even now, if you feel emotionally empty or spiritually exhausted, the promises inside the Psalms remind you that God has not abandoned you in your weakness. He sees every battle you are fighting internally, every burden you are carrying silently, and every moment where you feel like giving up. His strength is still available for the weary heart, and his power is still able to sustain those who can no longer carry life alone. That is why the Psalms become such a powerful refuge during seasons of darkness. They remind you that even when life feels uncertain, painful, or lonely, God's presence never leaves his people. There are moments when darkness seems to settle over every part of life. You may pray and still feel silence. You may look around and see no clear direction forward. Fear, grief, disappointment, and company and confusion can make it seem as though God is distant. Yet hidden throughout the Psalms is the unshakable promise that no darkness is powerful enough to separate you from his presence. Psalm 139 carries one of the most comforting truths ever written. It declares that even if you make your bed in the depths or walk through darkness, God is still there. Darkness may hide things from human eyes, but it cannot hide you from God. He sees every tear, every sleepless night, every silent struggle, and every battle taking place inside your heart. Even when nobody else understands what you are carrying, his presence remains near. Many people expect God's presence to feel dramatic all the time, but often he moves most deeply during quiet and difficult seasons. Sometimes his presence is not revealed through loud miracles, but through the strength to survive another day when you thought you could not continue. The Psalms reveal a God who stays close during suffering instead of abandoning his people in it. David understood this personally. He experienced betrayal, danger, loneliness, and heartbreak, yet he repeatedly returned to the confidence that God had never truly left him. There are seasons, and where darkness enters through loss. The loss of peace, relationships, opportunities, or dreams can leave a person feeling empty inside. Questions begin filling the mind. Why did this happen? Why has the answer not come yet? Why does the pain continue? The Psalms never pretend those questions do not exist. In fact, many Psalms begin with cries of confusion and sorrow. But even in those cries, there is still a thread of faith holding on to God's presence. Psalm 23 speaks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, while fearing no evil because God is near. Notice that the psalm does not promise the valley will never exist. It promises that you will not walk through it alone. That changes everything. Darkness becomes less terrifying when you realize God himself is walking beside you. His presence becomes the source of courage when circumstances offer none. Sometimes darkness comes through spiritual exhaustion. You may feel distant from joy, motivation, or hope. You may continue functioning outwardly while inwardly feeling numb and drained. During those moments, the enemy often tries to convince you that God has forgotten you. But the Psalms answer those lies repeatedly, and again they remind the weary soul that God remains faithful even when emotions feel unstable. His presence is not dependent on what you feel in a moment. He remains near because of who he is. One of the hidden promises inside the Psalms is that God is especially close to broken hearts. Pain often creates an awareness of God's presence that comfort never could. When every distraction disappears and human strength runs out, people begin seeking him with greater honesty and dependence. The Psalms show that God does not reject broken people. He draws near to them. He listens carefully to wounded hearts and stays beside those who feel crushed by life. Darkness also has a way of making time feel longer. A difficult season can make it seem as though nothing will ever change. Waiting becomes exhausting when answers delay and prayers remain unanswered. David experienced this deeply. There were moments when he cried out, asking God how long the suffering would continue. Yet even while waiting, he kept reminding his soul to trust in God's unfailing love. That trust became a light inside the darkness. The Psalms reveal that God's presence is constant even when circumstances change, and people may walk away. Situations may collapse unexpectedly. Emotions may rise and fall like waves. But God does not abandon his people in the middle of their hardest seasons. His presence remains steady through every valley, every painful chapter, and every uncertain night. Even when you cannot clearly see what God is doing, the Psalms encourage you to keep believing that he is still working behind the scenes. Darkness may surround your situation today, but darkness has never been able to overcome the faithfulness of God. His presence continues walking beside you through every trial, quietly strengthening your heart, even in moments where you feel weak, forgotten, or afraid. That is why the Psalms continue reminding the soul that pain is never the final chapter. No matter how heavy the night feels, God's promises declare that joy will return again. There are seasons in life where happiness feels far away, and the heart becomes tired from carrying disappointment after disappointment. People can lose hope slowly without even realizing it. The weight of unanswered prayers, emotional wounds, and difficult circumstances can make it seem as though joy has permanently and disappeared. Yet hidden inside the Psalms is the promise that sorrow does not last forever. Psalm 30 speaks directly to this struggle when it says that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. That verse has carried countless people through seasons of grief because it reminds them that pain has an expiration date in God's hands. The night may feel long, but morning still arrives. Darkness may surround you for a season, but it cannot stop God from bringing restoration at the right time. David understood emotional pain deeply. He experienced betrayal from people he trusted, attacks from enemies, loneliness, guilt, and heartbreak. There were moments where he felt overwhelmed by sorrow and cried openly before God. Yet throughout the Psalms, something powerful keeps happening. No matter how broken the moment became, David continued returning to hope. He believed that God could restore joy even after seasons of suffering. That belief became the anchor that kept his faith alive during difficult times. Many people think joy only exists when life becomes perfect, but the Psalms reveal something deeper. God's joy is not dependent on perfect circumstances. It is rooted and deep in His presence and faithfulness. There are people who appear successful outwardly yet remain empty inside, because true joy cannot be created through possessions, status, or temporary pleasures. The Psalms point toward a joy that survives hardship because it flows from knowing God is still in control. Sometimes sorrow changes a person quietly over time. A painful season can make someone guarded, emotionally distant, or fearful of hoping again. After enough disappointment, people begin expecting more pain instead of expecting restoration. But the Psalms challenge that mindset by reminding the soul of God's goodness repeatedly. They encourage people not to build their identity around temporary suffering. The pain may be real, but it is not permanent. One of the hidden promises inside the Psalms is that God restores what sorrow tries to steal. He restores peace to troubled hearts, strength to weary souls, and hope to those who feel defeated. Restoration does not always happen instantly, but God works patiently within broken places. Sometimes healing happens so gradually that you do not notice it at first. Little by little, heaviness begins lifting. Strength slowly returns. The heart and RT starts believing again. The Psalms also show that joy often grows strongest after seasons of hardship. A person who has experienced deep pain understands gratitude differently. They learn to treasure peace, appreciate small blessings, and recognize God's faithfulness in ways they never noticed before. David praised God not because his life was easy, but because he had seen God carry him through impossible moments. His joy was built on experience with God's faithfulness. There are moments when it may feel impossible to imagine joy returning. You may look at your current situation and wonder how anything good could come from it. But the Psalms constantly remind you that God specializes in bringing beauty from brokenness. He can breathe life into places that seem emotionally exhausted. He can restore hearts that feel empty and renew minds that have grown weary from constant struggle. Even while waiting for better days, the Psalms encourage the heart to keep praising God. Praise becomes an act of faith during difficult seasons. It declares that sorrow will not have the final word. It reminds the soul that God's goodness still exists even when circumstances seem painful. David often praised God before the breakthrough came because he trusted God's character more than his current emotions. Joy returning again does not mean pretending pain never happened. The Psalms never encourage denial. Instead, they show that God is able to heal, strengthen, and restore people through their suffering. The scars may remain, but they no longer control the future. What once brought despair can eventually become a testimony of God's sustaining grace. If your heart feels heavy today, the Psalms remind you not to lose hope in the middle of the process. Seasons change, darkness passes. Healing comes slowly but surely through the faithfulness of God. The same Lord who carried his people through sorrow in the past is still able to restore joy, renew strength, and bring light back into hearts that have been burdened for far too long. That is why the Psalms continually invite people to bring every burden, fear, and prayer before God without hesitation. Hidden within these sacred words is the comforting promise that God hears every prayer and every silent cry. Nothing escapes his attention. Not the whispered prayers spoken through tears, not the thoughts hidden deep and inside the heart, and not the moments when pain becomes too heavy for words. The Psalms reveal a God who listens carefully to his people, even when the world ignores their struggles. There are seasons when people feel unheard. They speak, but nobody understands. They explain their pain, but nobody truly sees the depth of what they are carrying. Over time, silence can make a person feel invisible. Yet the Psalms repeatedly remind the weary soul that God is never distant from honest cries. Psalm 34 says that the righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them and delivers them from all their troubles. That promise carries tremendous comfort because it reveals that heaven is never closed to a sincere heart. David often poured out his emotions openly before God. He did not hide his fears, frustrations, or questions. He prayed while afraid, while exhausted, while hunted by enemies, and while grieving personal failures. The Psalms show that prayer was not a performance for David. It was survival. He understood that God welcomed honesty more than perfection. Even in moments where his emotions felt overwhelming, he kept turning toward God instead of away from him. Many people silently carry and prayers they have stopped speaking aloud because they feel discouraged by waiting. They wonder if God has forgotten them or if their prayers matter anymore. But the Psalms answer those fears by reminding you that God hears even the cries no one else notices. Sometimes the deepest prayers are not spoken through long sentences at all. They come through tears, exhaustion, or moments where the heart simply whispers for help. God understands every one of them completely. One of the most powerful truths found in the Psalms is that God listens with compassion, not judgment. Human beings may grow impatient with weakness, but God responds with mercy. Psalm 103 describes him as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and rich in love. That means you do not have to approach him pretending to be strong. You can come to him honestly, carrying every fear, doubt, and burden exactly as it is. There are moments when answers seem delayed and silence feels confusing. David experienced those moments too. He often cried out asking God how long he would have to wait. Yet even while wrestling with uncertainty, he continued praying because he trusted that God was still listening. The Psalms teach that, and delayed answers do not mean ignored prayers. God works according to wisdom far greater than human understanding. Sometimes he answers immediately. Sometimes he strengthens the heart while waiting. Sometimes he protects people from things they cannot yet see. Prayer in the Psalms was never limited to moments of peace. David prayed during battles, failures, victories, loneliness, and fear. That reveals another hidden promise. There is no wrong moment to call on God. You do not need perfect faith, perfect words, or perfect emotions before approaching him. The Psalms show that God welcomes broken prayers from weary hearts. Sometimes people believe they must hide certain emotions from God, especially anger, disappointment, or confusion. But the Psalms reveal complete honesty before him. David asked difficult questions, cried openly, and expressed deep sorrow, yet God still called him a man after his own heart. Why? Because David kept bringing everything back to God, instead of allowing pain to separate him from his presence. The Psalms also remind you that God not only hears prayers, but he remembers them. Every cry matters to him. Every burden placed before him is seen. Even prayer. and S that seem unanswered are not forgotten. God works in ways beyond human timing, often shaping hearts during seasons of waiting. While people may only see silence, God may already be preparing strength, wisdom, protection, or restoration behind the scenes. There is also comfort in knowing that God hears the prayers you cannot fully explain. Some pain runs too deep for words. Some struggles are so personal that speaking them aloud feels impossible. Yet the Psalms reveal a God who understands the language of the heart completely. He sees what others overlook and listens to what others never hear. Even today, if your soul feels weary from waiting or carrying silent burdens, the promises hidden inside the Psalms remind you that your prayers are not disappearing into emptiness. God still listens carefully to every cry that rises from an honest heart. His ears remain open to the broken, the weary, the fearful, and the hopeful. No prayer offered in faith is ever wasted before Him. That is why the Psalms continue giving strength to people in every generation who feel tired, uncertain, or close to giving up. Hidden within these powerful verses is the promise that God's words circle, and in no place courage back into a fearful heart. Life has a way of draining confidence over time. Battles, disappointments, failures, and delays can slowly weaken a person's spirit until they begin doubting whether they can continue moving forward. Yet the Psalms speak directly into those moments, reminding the soul that courage does not come from human ability alone. It comes from trusting the faithfulness of God. There are seasons where moving forward feels difficult because fear keeps whispering worst-case scenarios into the mind. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of losing what matters most, or fear that nothing will ever improve. The Psalms understand these emotions because David himself experienced them repeatedly. He faced enemies, uncertainty, betrayal, and moments where his future seemed completely unstable. Yet despite everything surrounding him, he kept returning to one truth: God was greater than the fear standing in front of him. Psalm 27 carries this confidence powerfully when David declares that the Lord is his light and salvation, so he will not fear. That kind of courage was not based on perfect circumstances. It was built on trust in God's character. David knew, and that if God remained with him, then no battle, no enemy, and no season of uncertainty could truly destroy him. The Psalms invite every weary heart into that same confidence today. Courage does not mean never feeling afraid. The Psalms never portray faith as the absence of struggle. Instead, they reveal courage as the decision to keep trusting God, even while fear tries to take control. David often acknowledged his fears honestly, but he refused to let those fears become greater than his faith. Again and again he reminded himself of God's past faithfulness. He remembered the times God protected him before, strengthened him before, and carried him through impossible situations before. Those memories gave him strength to continue moving forward. Many people become spiritually stuck because discouragement convinces them to stop trying. After enough setbacks, they lose motivation to pray, hope, or dream again. But the Psalms challenge that hopelessness. They remind the soul that God is still able to guide, restore, and strengthen his people, no matter how difficult the journey becomes. Even when progress feels slow, God continues working through every season. One of the hidden promises and ease inside the Psalms is that God provides courage for each step, not necessarily the entire journey at once. Sometimes people want to see the whole future clearly before moving forward, but faith often grows one step at a time. The Psalms teach dependence on God daily. They remind you that his strength is renewed continually for those who trust him. You may not have the strength for next year today, but God will provide what you need for this moment. The Psalms also reveal that courage grows through worship and remembrance. David frequently spoke about God's goodness, power, and faithfulness during difficult seasons. By focusing on who God was, his perspective began shifting away from fear. Praise became a weapon against discouragement. Worship reminded his soul that God's authority was greater than every obstacle surrounding him. There are moments when life leaves scars that make trusting again difficult. Painful experiences can cause people to guard their hearts and expect disappointment. But the Psalms continue calling people back to faith. They remind you that your past struggles do not determine your future. God is still able to open doors, create new beginnings, and lead you, and until into places of restoration even after seasons of heartbreak. The courage found in the Psalms is not shallow motivation. It is deep spiritual confidence rooted in the belief that God remains faithful no matter what changes around you. That confidence allows people to keep walking even when answers are delayed. It allows them to keep praying even when they feel weary. It allows them to keep believing even after difficult seasons try to break their spirit. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to quit, refusing to let fear silence your faith, refusing to let disappointment destroy your hope, refusing to let temporary darkness convince you that God has abandoned you. The Psalms strengthen the heart for those moments by reminding you repeatedly that God walks beside his people through every challenge they face. Even today, if you feel tired from the battles you have been carrying, the promises hidden inside the Psalms are still powerful enough to steady your heart and help you keep moving forward. God's faithfulness has not weakened. His presence has not disappeared. His strength is still available for every weary soul willing to trust him one more time.